I was reading quietly in my garden, enjoying the peace of a summer afternoon, when my neighbor suddenly appeared at the gate. What he told me that day turned my entire world upside down in ways I never imagined. Before I tell you everything, let me ask you, from which city are you watching us right now? I love knowing how far these stories travel. Share it in the comments while I take you back to that moment. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air seems to shimmer faintly under the sun, and the only sounds are the lazy hum of bees drifting between blossoms. I had settled into the old wicker chair tucked under the shade of my magnolia tree, a book balanced on my lap, and a glass of iced tea sweating on the small wooden table beside me. That garden was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world and just be. I remember the smell of the earth that day, rich and comforting after I had watered the flower beds earlier. My roses had just begun to bloom, their petals blushing pink against the deep green leaves, and the lavender I had planted along the fence released its calm fragrance every time a breeze passed through. It was one of those afternoons when nothing seemed likely to disturb the stillness. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. At first, I thought it might just be the mailman, but when I looked up, there he was, my neighbor Thomas. He was standing just outside the open gate, his figure half lit by the dappled sunlight breaking through the trees. Thomas wasn't a stranger to me. We had exchanged pleasantries many times, about the weather, the state of our lawns, or the occasional neighborhood news. But he had never simply wandered into my garden uninvited. "Afternoon," he said, his voice warm but carrying a weight that caught my attention immediately. He wasn't smiling the way he usually did. There was something more serious in his expression, though it was softened by a kind of gentleness that made me set my book aside without hesitation. I gestured for him to come in, curious. "Well, you've caught me in the middle of a chapter, but you're welcome to interrupt. Pull up a chair if you like." He stepped carefully along the path, pausing for a moment to admire the roses. "You've done wonders with this garden. Every time I pass by, it feels like I should stop and breathe it all in, like I'd be missing something if I didn't." The compliment caught me off guard. I felt my cheeks warm, not just from the sun. Gardening was something I did quietly, without much expectation of notice. To hear someone appreciate it so sincerely felt strangely intimate. He sat across from me, folding his hands in front of him on the table. For a few moments, we just listened to the birds chattering in the trees, the silence between us not uncomfortable but charged with an awareness I couldn't quite name. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "I came here today because I've been meaning to tell you something. I wasn't sure if I should, but I think I'd regret it if I didn't." My heart gave the faintest tremor, though I kept my face calm. There was something about his tone, quiet but firm, as though he had rehearsed this moment many times, that stirred a mix of curiosity and unease inside me. "What is it?" I asked softly. He exhaled, and his eyes moved over the garden before returning to me. "I've been carrying around words I haven't spoken, and it feels like they've grown too heavy. I don't know if they'll change anything, but I need you to hear them." The world seemed to still in that instant. Even the bees had gone silent in my awareness. It was just the two of us, sitting across from each other in a garden that suddenly felt smaller, more enclosed, like it had drawn in around us to listen. I could see the conflict in his face, the hesitation balanced against determination. And something inside me, though I didn't yet understand it, leaned toward him, waiting, bracing, and yet oddly open to whatever truth he was about to uncover. He didn't rush it. He took a slow breath, as if measuring the air for the right words, and then set them down carefully between us. "I think about how short time is," he said, "and how often we wait for the perfect moment that never comes. I didn't want to wait any more to tell you that your presence on this street has been a kind of anchor for me. I notice when your porch light comes on a little earlier in the winter. I notice when the first roses open. I notice you, and I'd like to know you properly if you'd ever let me. My first instinct was to sit very still so nothing spilled, tea, words, whatever it was that had risen in my chest all at once. I looked at his hands, steady on the table, the small nicks and pale lines that come from years of doing things yourself. He didn't reach across, didn't crowd me. He let the air stay open. That, more than anything, calmed me. I don't know what to say, I answered, which was honest and also a way of buying time. It's been a while since anyone spoke to me like that. I know, he said. It's been a while for me, too. A breeze lifted the corner of my bookmark, and the magnolia leaves whispered overhead. Somewhere on the next street, a lawnmower coughed to life and then quieted. Everything ordinary was still happening, and yet the afternoon had tilted. I realized I was waiting for a follow-up, pressure, a pitch, a joke to undo the seriousness. But none came. His restraint was the gentlest invitation I'd felt in years. My husband, Mark, used to sit in that chair, I said, nodding at the empty wicker by the same table. He read the newspaper out loud to make me laugh. 3 summers and 6 winters without him, and I still keep 2 chairs out of habit. I remember him, Thomas said. The way he waved at everyone, even cars that were just passing through. I smiled at that, a small ache pressing warm behind my ribs. I've grown comfortable in the stillness, I admitted, maybe too comfortable. There's comfort, he said, and then there's hiding. I do both better than I should. It disarmed me, the way he folded his own flaws into the conversation like he was adding sugar to tea. I poured him a glass without asking, the ice clinking against the sides, and watched a bead of water slide down his thumb as he lifted it. He set the glass back in exactly the ring of moisture it had left, a precise, gentle habit that said as much as any declaration. What would knowing me properly look like? I asked finally. No grand gestures, he said, and I could hear how much thought he'd given this. Maybe starting with small ones. Talking on walks. Helping you fix that gate hinge that squeaks when you're carrying groceries. Bringing over a book I think you'll like, not because I'm pushing tastes on you, but because I want to see your face when you talk about something that moved you. If none of that feels right, then I stay your neighbor and mow my side of the strip without making a fuss. But if it does feel right, I'd like to try. I laughed softly, because the squeak on the hinge is the kind of thing I'd sworn I'd get to every Saturday and never did. You noticed the hinge, I said. I notice things, he answered, not apologetic, not proud, just true. We let another pocket of silence open between us, this one easier. My mind went to all the versions of myself I had carefully arranged since Mark died. The efficient one who knows which days the garbage trucks come, the considerate one who bakes extra muffins for the new family down the block, the quiet one who doesn't make a fuss, who never needs help, who keeps her heart folded away like wedding linens you only open on anniversaries. It was a useful arrangement. It also felt suddenly like a room I'd outgrown without realizing it. I'm not making promises, I said. I don't even know what promises would look like anymore. I didn't come for promises, he said, just to tell the truth. Another bee nosed at the lavender and then lifted, zigzagging toward the sun. Thomas sat with a patience that never tipped into pity. He asked nothing of me, and somehow that made me want to offer something. I picked up the book from my lap and turned it so the cover faced him. It's a memoir, I said, about a woman who moved to the coast after her husband died. She describes learning how to cook just for one, how to walk without thinking of the destination, how to name the birds that come to her window. It sounds lonely, but it wasn't written that way. It felt like she was practicing a different way to belong. "What did you underline?" he asked, and the question surprised me with its accuracy. I flipped to a page softened by my thumb and showed him a sentence about courage. How it doesn't arrive as a drumbeat, but as a breath you notice only when you try not to hold it. "I like that," he said. "Breathing is underrated." I set the book down. The light had shifted, late afternoon lifting toward evening, and the shadows of the fence slatted across the grass like a quiet piano. I could feel a familiar tendency in me to tidy up the moment, to say something gracious and send him on his way, so I could sit with the safety of what-ifs that never have to be tested. But there was another part of me, smaller, newer, that wanted to leave the gate open. "Would you walk with me?" I asked. "Just around the block. We can test whether conversation is as easy out there as it is in here." He smiled, not triumphant, just relieved. "I'd like that," he said, and he stood, waiting for me to rise first, as if we were stepping into a dance I'd forgotten but my body still knew. We took the side path past the hydrangeas, their big blue heads bowed like old ladies sharing secrets. The gate protested on cue with its familiar squeal. He glanced at it, and I did too, and for once I didn't feel the little spark of failure about it. We turned left toward the big sycamore at the corner. The sidewalks here are patched and soft at the edges, where grass grows in the cracks like stubborn joy. At first we talked about simple things, the neighbor's dog that chases his own tail, the way the mail carrier sings to himself, the new bakery on Linden that sells bread warm enough to make you eat it in the car. Then the conversation turned, naturally as a river finds its own deeper channel, toward the parts of ourselves we keep in the back room. He told me about Margaret, his wife, gone 4 years now. How she kept a notebook of things she wanted to try someday, and how, after she passed, he went through and did them one by one, badly in some cases, bravely in others. He took a watercolor class and painted a bowl of pears that looked like a family reunion of green moons. He learned to make her soup, the one with thyme and barley. And he never got the seasoning quite right, but the act of stirring steadied him. I told him about the quiet after the casseroles stop arriving, about learning to fix the leaky faucet because the drip at 2 in the morning sounded like a metronome measuring out a life too empty to dance, about how the garden saved me in small increments, the way a seed asks only 2 things, patience and water, and rewards you with a color you didn't know you needed. We passed Mrs. Ellery's porch, where wind chimes made of old spoons tapped a gentle rhythm and waved. She smiled a little too broadly, and I realized in that instant how visible this walk must look from a neighbor's window. To my surprise, the thought didn't make me retreat. It made me stand taller. At the far corner we paused. The sun had tilted low enough to throw a warm holiday light across the tops of the hedges. Thomas looked at me, not searching for an answer, but holding space for one if I had it. "What you said," I told him. It didn't frighten me. It stirred dust I'd been content to live with. I'm not ready to name anything, but I'm ready to admit I want more of days like this. "Then let's practice days like this," he said. "No maps, no rush." We turned back toward home, the evening folding softly over the roofs like a shawl. When we reached my gate, he stopped. "Would it be all right if I look at that hinge tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll bring the right oil. It won't take but 10 minutes. "Bring 20, I said. "I'll make coffee." He laughed, and the sound was light, easy, a note that lingered on the air even after he said goodnight and crossed to his yard. I stood a moment longer in the doorway, hand on the frame, feeling a small but definite shift inside me. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been taken. And yet something had begun, quietly, like a breath you realize you've been holding, finally let go. I went back to my chair and picked up the memoir, but I didn't read. I watched the last light touch the roses, and I thought about hinges, how they don't change what a door is, only how easily it opens. Tomorrow, I decided, I would open the gate myself and wait to see if he came through with a tin of oil and that careful, patient way he had of noticing the world. If he did, we'd talk. The garden would still be here, and so would I, only now I understood that the stillness I'd curated so faithfully could hold company too. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The air was still damp with dew, the grass glistening as though someone had dusted the yard with tiny diamonds overnight. I made my coffee stronger than I normally would, almost as if bracing myself, though I wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. I told myself it was habit, the same way I had gotten used to laying out 2 mugs, even though only one was ever filled. That morning, though, I set 2 mugs deliberately. By mid-morning, the sun had begun to warm the garden, and I was kneeling by the rose bushes with my gloves on, pruning back the wayward stems. That's when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path again. The sound was lighter this time, almost careful, as though Thomas didn't want to break the spell of the day. "You were serious," I said, standing and brushing the dirt from my gloves as he came through the gate, a small tin of oil in one hand, a screwdriver tucked into his back pocket. "I told you, it only takes 10 minutes, he replied with a small smile. "Well, I'll take the 20. I handed him the mug I'd already poured, still steaming. He accepted it without fuss, like he'd been here before, though we both knew this was new ground for us. He set the coffee down beside him and knelt at the gate hinge, rolling his sleeves up in that practical way that makes you think of trust. His forearms were tanned, dusted with faint scars and freckles, evidence of a life lived fixing things, working with his hands. The squeak gave way almost immediately to a soft glide, the sound so minor, and yet the difference so significant I laughed out loud. "You make it look easy." "It usually is," he said, wiping the hinge clean. "It's just that we let the small things stay broken until they sound louder than they should." That landed in me like a stone dropped in water, rippling outward. I thought about the faucet I had fixed, the weeds I had pulled, the small ways I had tried to keep my world upright after Mark's absence. But there were other things I had left untouched: grief, longing, fear of opening myself to someone again. Things that had squeaked in my chest so long I'd learned to tune them out. We sat together afterward, drinking the rest of the coffee on the porch steps instead of the garden chairs. The silence between us felt different now, not charged as it had been yesterday, but companionable, steady. He leaned back on his palms, looking out over the yard. "You know," he said, "Margaret used to say a garden is the most honest reflection of a person. You can tell if they rush, if they neglect, if they nurture. Yours," he glanced at me then, "is patient. That tells me something." I didn't know how to answer right away. Compliments like that don't bounce off easily. They settle in and demand you look at yourself differently. After a while, I said, patience wasn't a choice. It was survival. When everything else stopped making sense, planting seeds gave me something I could still believe in. He nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you think." The afternoon stretched comfortably. At one point, he asked if I needed help trimming back the lavender. I almost said no out of habit, but something in me softened, and I handed him the shears. We worked in tandem, the scent rising all around us, clinging to our hands, our sleeves. And though we didn't talk much, every snip of the stems felt like an unspoken agreement that we were learning how to share space without crowding each other. Later, when the heat began to sink into the grass, he wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "I don't want to overstay, but I'd like to come back. Not just to fix things, though I don't mind that. To keep talking, or even not talking, if that's what the day calls for." I looked at him for a long moment. His eyes held no expectation, only sincerity. That mattered more than I could explain. "I think I'd like that," I said. That evening, after he'd gone, I found myself moving through the house differently. The rooms felt less like places I endured and more like spaces waiting for something new. I made dinner, nothing special, just pasta with tomatoes from the garden, but I set the table with more care than I had in years. A small candle, a folded napkin, a plate I usually saved for company. It wasn't for him, not yet. It was for me, to remind myself I could expect more than routine. As I ate, I thought about the way he'd oiled the hinge. Such a small, ordinary act, and yet it had cracked something open in me. The gate no longer protested when I opened it, and maybe, just maybe, neither did I. When night fell, I stepped into the garden one last time. The roses glowed pale in the moonlight, and the air was cool against my skin. I realized that for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the next day. Not out of duty, not out of distraction, but out of hope. And that hope carried his face, his voice, the quiet steadiness of his presence. I whispered it into the dark, not for anyone to hear but myself. "I'm ready to see what this could become." And as the crickets began their evening chorus, I knew deep down that whatever happened next, something in my life had already shifted. The hinge had been oiled. The gate could open. And maybe, just maybe, so could I. That night I slept more soundly than I had in months. The steady rhythm of crickets outside the window was no longer a reminder of loneliness, but a kind of lullaby, reassuring in its persistence. When morning came, it wasn't just another day to get through. It felt like a page waiting to be written. By mid-morning, Thomas returned, not with tools this time, but with a paper bag tucked under his arm. "Peace offering," he said when I opened the gate that swung now without a sound. Inside the bag were 2 pastries from the new bakery on Linden, still warm, their sugar dusting his fingertips. We ate them in the garden, the flaky crust scattering across our plates, and for the first time in years, I caught myself laughing with ease. It wasn't the kind of laughter that comes from a joke. It was the kind that slips out when the weight you've been carrying suddenly feels lighter, even if just for a moment. He smiled at the sound, but he didn't remark on it. He just let it be. That small courtesy, of not drawing attention to my unguardedness, was a gift. As the day stretched on, we talked less about loss and more about what came after. He told me about a book he wanted to write, nothing grand, just a collection of small stories about the neighborhood. The old couple who still held hands on their porch swing, the teenager who mowed lawns for college savings, the stray cat who had adopted everyone but belonged to no one. I told him about how I'd always dreamed of traveling west, to see the desert bloom in the spring, to stand in front of red canyons that looked carved by time itself. "Why didn't you ever go?" he asked gently. I paused, realizing I didn't have an answer that wasn't an excuse. I kept waiting for the right time, waiting for someone to come with me, waiting until the garden was just so, until life felt stable again, and waiting turned into years. He nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. Maybe the right time isn't waiting out there somewhere. Maybe it's this. The words hummed between us like wind chimes catching a soft breeze. They weren't a promise or a declaration. They were an opening. That evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in long strokes of orange and lavender, I found myself standing at the gate again, watching him walk back to his own yard. Before he disappeared into his house, he turned, raised his hand, and said, "Tomorrow, then." I didn't hesitate. Tomorrow. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. That came a week later. We had settled into a rhythm. Morning walks, shared coffee, the occasional chore done side by side. Each encounter was small, ordinary, and yet carried with it the sense that something larger was quietly building beneath the surface. On that particular afternoon, I was back in the garden with my book, the magnolia tree shading me as always. Thomas came by, leaned against the fence, and said, almost as if it had just occurred to him, "Do you ever realize how rare it is to be seen?" I looked up, caught off guard. He went on, "People wave, they smile, they chat about the weather. But being seen, really seen, that's different. I think you deserve that." The words struck me with such force that for a moment I couldn't breathe. My husband had loved me deeply, but since his passing I had wrapped myself in invisibility, blending into the routines of widowhood, safe from expectations. To hear Thomas name what I hadn't admitted even to myself, that I longed to be seen again, was like having a door quietly unlocked in my chest. I set the book aside, my fingers trembling slightly. "And you think you see me?" He met my gaze without wavering. "I don't just think it. I know it." Tears rose before I could stop them, not of sadness, but of recognition. It had been so long since anyone's words touched me that deeply reached past the masks I wore and pressed against the part of me that was still alive, still capable of warmth, still capable of beginning again. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let the moment settle, let the truth of it sink in. Finally, I whispered, "Then maybe I've been waiting for you to say that." Something softened in his face then, and though he didn't move closer, though nothing physical crossed the space between us, I felt more connected to him in that instant than I had to anyone in years. The garden around us seemed to hold its breath. The roses leaned slightly in the breeze, the magnolia leaves shivered faintly, and the gate stood quietly on its newly oiled hinge, ready for whatever would come next. From that day forward, everything was different. Not because we rushed into declarations or tried to rewrite the past, but because I had let myself be seen again. And once you are truly seen, you can't return to hiding. I'd often think back to that first afternoon when I was simply reading in my garden and he appeared at the gate. I had no idea then that a few words, spoken with courage and kindness, could tilt the world so profoundly. But they did. And now, when I walk through my garden in the evenings, I don't just see roses and lavender and magnolia leaves. I see possibility. I see companionship. I see myself, alive, visible, and no longer waiting.